All right. Hello and welcome back to another fun-filled episode of the Hammercast. I am your host, Alex, the Hebrew Hammer Salkin, and joining me today is a mysterious stranger who goes by the term Bowtied Bengal. He is a phenomenal physical therapist. Followed him for quite a while on Twitter as well. I'm not ever going to call it X, by the way. It's only ever going to be called Twitter. I don't care what anybody says. It's Twitter, all right. But also, he has great emails that he sends out, very, very informative. And I wanted to get him on the podcast to talk a little bit about let's say the meeting of physical therapy and physical training, because I think that there is a lot of carryover between one and the other, and obviously there's supposed to be. And I want to get a little bit deeper insight as well as understanding good physical therapy from, let's say, physical therapy that could use a little bit of work. Now, before we get started, I want to remind my lovely audience that if you have not already, go and get my free 9-minute kettlebell and bodyweight challenge. As the name implies, it only takes 9 minutes to do, and it's designed to be done in conjunction with your regular training. So you don't have to put your regular workouts to the side. You can do it either before, as some people like to do, as kind of like a part of an extended warm up, or after, as a sort of like a finisher. But the moves in it are super simple to learn. It takes about 30 seconds. There's nothing complicated, nothing dangerous. You're not going to have to seek out a physical therapist, most likely, just because you decided to add this challenge into your training. But if you go to 9minutechallenge.com, you can get your own free copy. That is the number 9minutechallenge.com. So without further ado, Bowtied Bengal, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Alex.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time, and you and I went back and forth via email to try to set this up, and I'm glad we're able to sit down for a chat. And one thing I'm very curious about is your origin story, because I have a very good friend who's been on this podcast before, Mike Haffenbrack, who was a world champion powerlifter when he was younger, and went on to become a physical therapist. And I've known other people who've gotten into physical therapy, and the stories, of course, about why they get into it are always different. But the sense that I get is that a lot of people get into physical therapy first as kind of a way to ease their own aches and pains, and then, similar to a lot of personal trainers, they decide, this is something I really enjoy and I want to help people, so maybe I'll turn this into a profession. But is that how you got into it? Like, what's your origin story behind why you got into physical therapy?
Well, I started in the military. Spent about 6 years in the Army, and then with just like random military things, that's when I kind of got really into like training.
Mm-hmm.
Like there were times in the military where you realize that, hey, my physical prep, this isn't working. Like everything I read in muscle and fitness growing up and still do or did at the time, it's like, hey, I don't know if this, when you're doing like actual combat operations, it's kind of a totally different thing. So that kind of sent me down like the like physical training like rabbit hole, I guess. It's not working out. Like I don't work out. I train, I
Yeah.
guess, if you put it that way. And then I spent a lot of time, took me down kind of like the CrossFit route, just like general strength conditioning kind of things. And then I got out of the Army, and then I worked for like corporate America, and then it was kind of like, the job's kind of boring. So it's kind of like, what do I do now? At the time, in the CrossFit world, like Kelly Starrett was fairly popular.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, all right, well, he seems like he knows a lot of stuff. Like I'd be at the gym and I'd be trying to like, oh, well, how does this Olympic weightlifting work? How does this powerlifting work? And then I kind of reached the ceiling on like how much knowledge I knew. And I figured I needed to go and like get this background knowledge first. And like he was a PT and he seemed like he knew what he was talking about. So I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, PT school, maybe that's the way. So I went to PT school. My undergrad degree is in finance. So I had to like take the prereqs for PT school. That took me like a couple years. And then PT school was 3 years. So it's kind of like a 5-year kind of detour.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got all the regular PT jobs, and I still kind of kept a foot in the gym. Been in a lot of CrossFit gyms, done a lot of other things. And then now, like kind of randomly, I actually work with mostly military now. So I'm able to kind of help them achieve like actual like fitness related things. So I guess in a way was more of like solving my own problems. I got lots of things that hurt and I still wanted to train. So it was, how could I do this and like be good at it?
Hmm.
And you kind of figure out how training and like training and rehab tie together, I guess.
Hmm. It's interesting, and it seems like your training was more oriented, at least in part, towards strength training. I'm sure being in the service, there was also plenty of, running and rucking and other cardio type of things. My sense has been that a lot of the people who get into physical therapy, at least, and again, this is something that my friend Mike corroborated, was that a lot of them were runners. And of course, they have these running injuries, and so that's how they get into it. But you have a very unique uh, entry into physical therapy if it's from the military and then also working with military. So, what are some of the, let's say, more common injuries or tweaks or roadblocks that a lot of people in the military seem to face now? And are these things that people have always faced, or are these like new problems that you're seeing?
I think they're things that they've always faced. I think it's the actual like physical, like the principles involved in like strength training, like strength and conditioning. I'm going to say strength and conditioning,
Hmm.
strength and conditioning principles that are necessary to like actually make you more fit, um, versus like kind of like what the military does.
Hmm.
Like if you think about it, this is an example I tell most, because a lot of the guys I work with are Marines, so Marines are on the extreme end of kind of like attitude wise. When you really think about like say recovery runs, like easy runs, zone two, et cetera, et cetera. Like me, my zone two on a run is like 11-minute mile.
Hmm.
Like if you were in a formation run and you needed to do like your recovery run for X distance,
Hmm.
and I was doing an 11-minute mile, someone would come up to me and like yell at me because I'd be falling out of the run.
Right.
So like most military, what they do is just kind of like everybody does this, right? Their aerobic stuff is too fast to be aerobic, and their like high intensity stuff is too slow to be high intensity. So like every
Mhm.
day is like this moderate intensity, like volume slog.
Yeah.
So a lot of your like soft tissue injuries, a lot of your overuse injuries are purely related to like how they train.
Hmm.
And then when you think of like they're trying to make combat fitness tests a little more like, you can't see me, but most of the times when I'm saying stuff, I'm holding up air quotes.
Right.
Uh, but they're making the combat fitness tests more like combat-y.
Hmm.
And then most guys will just kind of like, when they're 21, they can kind of get away with whatever. And then as they get older, 27, 35, 40, like you can't get away with that anymore.
Hmm.
Your training has to be a lot more logical. And then not
Yeah.
only is it an age thing, I don't know if it's an age thing. Like as you get older, you can still hit intensity. You just may not be able to do it as much. But a lot of it's more related to as you get older in the military and in regular life, you have more responsibility.
Hmm.
Like your job requires more from you. You have a family,
Hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. So like not only can you not get away with the training you did when you were 22, like you just don't have the recovery for it.
Yeah.
That's what I notice a lot of guys, um, that or just that see me that are hurt, back pain, knee pain, shoulder pain. It's like, all right, you're a 6'1", 250-pound Marine. Maybe you shouldn't do pull-ups to failure because I don't know. I don't know if that's a good idea. It's not a good
Yeah.
strategy.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, that'd be a good follow-up question then, because this is something I've been curious about for some time, is this concept of recovery. Because, it's like, obviously you see youngsters can just get away with all sorts of stuff. Like I remember when I was younger, for instance, it's like I could be out super late drinking with my friends, and then I'd be up early the next day, just have a little extra coffee, and then I was really no worse for the wear. I don't really drink heavily now, so I don't have the same I don't have the experience of what it's like to stay out late drinking and carrying on and stuff like that. But even stuff like that's seemingly non-physically related, you just give a wider margin for error. But what exactly are the mechanisms behind recovery, and why is it that it seems like even though we can continue to get stronger and hit, lifetime PRs as we hit our 40s, 50s, and beyond, our recovery just doesn't really keep up, and so we have to just change the way we train? Like, what are the mechanisms behind recovery that degrade, let's say, as we get older?
there's some of that I don't know, but
Mhm.
the things that I think are that you don't spend the time when you're younger like working on it, because
Mm.
you get away with so many things when you're younger. Like you're not building the base that's necessary. uh, as you get older, things should be easier.
Mhm.
So if you didn't spend the time when I was in the army, actually, I used to run 10K twice a week, and I would strap a heart rate monitor on, and I would go like super slow.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that one reason that my aerobic system is better than most is that I spent a lot of time doing that.
Mhm.
So as I get older and like I have to endure different things, I think that's given me. I like to think that's not an advantage. Well, I guess you could call it an advantage, but it's not an advantage relative to anybody else.
Mhm.
But it's just like I've taken the time to build that base.
Mhm.
So from a recovery standpoint, if all you've ever done is, I'll see this with like younger runners, especially female, just because it seems like females will kind of run a little more anxious than males, at
Mhm.
least at least like what you can see. Um, where it's like everything has to be like as fast as they can, and then by the time they get to a certain age, like you can't do that anymore. Like you don't have the recovery ability, so it's hard to get faster running
Mhm.
whenever you don't have the foundations for it.
Right. Right.
So as you're trying to raise the ceiling, if you've never raised the floor, the ceiling is going to be limited.
That's a good way to put it because, a lot of people, yeah, I would say if you just talk to the average layman, they would say, okay, yeah, you got to give it 110%. And they
Yeah,
just shout out other slogans or whatever. But it's
right,
like the
right.
reality is that it doesn't really work like that. If this is something that you want to do when you're much, much older, you need to slow down a little bit. It's the same thing. Like if somebody said you're gonna you're gonna need to go, I will say 20 miles on foot. You're not going to try to sprint the whole way. You're going to want to pace yourself. And it's like you kind of have to take that same approach with your training.
Yeah. It's similar to what you talked about before we started recording about business. It's like
Mhm.
there's a lot of these boring things that you have to do that no one likes to do. That's training. Training is a lot of boring things over and over again that you do because you think there's some payoff in the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of times it's kind of like, I have to do this thing right now and I need to do it as quickly as possible. And I think a lot of people they don't like training. Um, they want it to be over
Hmm.
as quickly as possible. Um, so it's like, well, if I run faster, then I'll be out here less. Uh,
Exactly.
yeah, strength is a little different. The kind of different mechanisms. I think
And
if you strength training and you have enough recovery, then obviously the number is always going to go up to an
right.
extent.
Now,
Um,
on that topic, then what is the connection between the aerobic system and strength training in terms of recovery? Because my understanding is that the better aerobic capacity you have, generally speaking, the faster you can recover from your strength training. Is this
yeah,
like an accurate statement? And how do those two kind of fit together?
uh, I think so. So the at the end of the day, I think it's just like tolerating stress.
Mm.
So if you think of, let's see, I'd have to have the picture to show you, but have you ever heard of an organization? I was looking through your YouTube and you do a lot of what's the strong first. Like I'm an RKC guy. Like you did a lot of strong first stuff.
Yep.
There's another organization called Strong Fit. It's this guy named Julian Pinot. He's a French guy. He's done a lot of like he's basically like this guy with autism that had a lot of time. So he
Mm.
read a bunch of studies and like worked with a lot of like higher level CrossFit athletes and developed like his own system of things. But he talks about just the nervous system in general. When you think about the nervous system, like you're basically spending your day kind of going back and forth between flow and fight and flight, et cetera, et
Mm.
cetera. So from just like a normal person standpoint, like take strength training out of the equation, take um and just look at it as like from a person trying to live their normal everyday life.
Hmm.
So as I'm sitting here working, as we're sitting here having this conversation, we're just kind of in this like flow state. Say if we started getting into an argument, we would shift more towards like fight, just because you got to kind of get your heart rate up a little bit. And
Hmm.
if it was like a argument where like I can't back it up anymore, or I refuse to give in to whatever your points are, then I just start making fun of you, or ad hominem attacks, and
Right.
then like me, and then you'd get angry. Like then I'm starting to go into like flight, or then eventually I would just like shut down and not want to be in the conversation anymore. Right. So
Right.
that's kind of like that stress reaction that a normal person would go through. So it doesn't matter if the stimulus that sends you into that stress reaction is mental or physical, the body's going to do the same thing.
Hmm.
So when you really think about how the body works, if you think about it this way, like whether I go for a run, a slow run where I'm in flow state, or if I speed up where where I'm fighting, or I'm running too fast and my body can't produce energy fast enough to fuel it, that's gonna require some amount of energy and then when I'm done, I'm gonna have some recovery time.
Hmm.
The same thing is true for strength training. Strength training itself, like I come from the world of CrossFit, where strength training is a little bit different.
Hmm.
So you actually can see people in a workout going through this process.
Mm.
Um, Strong First do the kettlebell snatch test. You guys do that?
Yes, we do. I think
Yeah.
everybody bristles at the thought because it's so much different from everything else we do.
Yeah.
It's like normally between like for ballistics, it's like 10 reps, you're good. But
Yeah.
then there's like one time you got to do 100 reps. So it's like a kind of a big leap. But yeah,
Yeah.
still doing the snatch test. Absolutely.
So when you're in the test, like you kind of pump yourself up. You can't be like Hindu cow before you start.
Hmm.
You got to kind of ramp yourself up a little bit. But then once you get started, you want to like take appropriate rest breaks so you don't blow up.
Yeah.
And then in CrossFit workouts, or even there's some people, it's like as you start doing the snatches, you start switching hands and stuff like that. There's usually a moment in that test when it's like you don't want to be there anymore,
Oh, yeah.
right? So the goal of your training is to make the test so easy that the time you finish and the time you don't want to be there anymore are close to each other,
Hmm.
right? So that's just kind of like managing stress. Just if I'm just doing like some back squats, like
Hmm.
that doesn't really happen as often unless it's like getting super heavy.
Hmm.
So there's a price to be there. Like
Right.
the the higher, see, the bigger distance between that moment you don't want to be there and when you finish, the bigger distance between those two, the higher costs that you have to pay from a recovery standpoint.
Right.
Um, no, it's no different than work. If I'm at work for 8 hours and 4 hours into it, I don't want to be there anymore, and I got to be here another 4 hours. Like, what am I going to do when I get off work? I probably want to go drink. I want to go shut down, et
Hmm.
cetera, et cetera. So that's the way I look at just the human itself. And then we start adding in all these other things like, oh, is it strength training? Oh, is it running? Oh, is it you got two kids at home? So that's the fundamental part where I start. Um, I don't know if that answers your question, but
No, it does. I think, for the intrepid listener, what you'll get from that is certainly the idea that strength training is a stress, which people, I think, should, on a basic level, understand. And I
right.
think what you've done is shown, for instance, that the recovery time, if you want to put it in layman's terms, is that the difference between, or the distance between when you want to quit and when you're actually supposed to quit. The greater that distance, probably the longer amount of time you're going to need to recover, or the more more you're going to need to do to get back to that, we'll say baseline. Is that, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And then you need to spend like you need as much, it's not a one for one, but you need to spend a lot of time in that flow state, easy stuff,
Hmm.
to kind of counteract the effects of the more volume you've accumulated in the easy stuff, the easier it'll be to recover from the harder stuff. And it's not a
Mhm.
one-to-one like, and in running, if I'm looking at just like pure aerobic work, I guess the recommendations, you have people that say like 150 minutes, 3 hours, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you'll see them do like their high intensity intervals, you're talking like 15 seconds, 20 seconds, et cetera, et cetera. So
Mhm.
like, from a fitness standpoint, it's not a one-to-one. It's
Yeah.
probably like 4-to-1 or
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And it's interesting you mentioned this too, because I remember reading maybe a couple, I mean, I'd read it years ago, but I reread it a couple months ago. There was an article um on a guy he was anonymous, but he was a special forces operator in the U.S. military. He's in his 40s and still a very high level operator. And that's how he described his training, is that it was like mostly easy stuff. And
yeah,
that I think he said he wouldn't run any more than like on most weeks he wouldn't run more than 30 minutes at a clip. But
yeah,
he ran very frequently and he kept it very,
yeah,
very moderate. And of course, but then this guy could do ultra marathons. He would do like 50 or 100-mile runs, every once in a while. Like that was, a big part of his training, and he would just crush it. And a
yeah,
lot of other people in his age group would just completely flounder because they have a far more like overly intense approach to training, and it's not one that is focused, like you pointed out, on volume and just kind of putting in the road work necessary to build up your floor, which I thought was a really great way of describing that.
yeah. When you say people his age, you mean like other operators, or just in general that age group?
I think that age group in particular, because I'm sure other operators have a similar approach, given the fact that their job depends on their
Yeah,
physical fitness. But a lot of other recreational trainees, it's very hard. It's hard for people to hear reasonable. This is something I heard from Dan John, who said that people can't really hear it. Like you tell them, just train moderately, eat moderately, and just keep going for a long period of time. And like you said, people just want to get done as quickly as possible. So they're like, well, maybe if I really push the pace,
yeah,
I'll be able to be done quicker and I can get faster results. And they're just anxious and they're impatient and they don't look at things as a process. They only look at the destination. So they're
yeah,
only trying to go as fast as they can without realizing that there's really not much speed you can add on. You just sort of have to take each step one at a time.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I
a
think, go ahead.
the special forces guy. You know who Joe Jameson is?
No.
He's a conditioning guy. I think he does a lot of work with like MMA guys. But he has on his website, I think it's called 8 Weeks Out. But he talks about the special forces guys, and special forces selection kind of like selects for these characteristics just because they
Mm,
have to. But from a like genetic, I don't even call it genetic, but special forces operators, one thing they can do is that whole like fight flight stuff that we were talking about.
mm,
They can put themselves into fight faster than you, but more
mm,
importantly, they can pull themselves out of fight, out of like back into like a recovery state faster than you.
mm.
Um, so like it's kind of an innate ability that special forces selection selects for, not on purpose, probably, and I'm sure it's not on purpose. It's just the people that survive the training.
Yeah.
Like they're better than you at kind of like how quickly their nervous system adapts to things.
Interesting. You know,
So
that reminds me actually, I remember reading, you mentioned Strong First earlier, and of course I'm a total geek for all sorts of stuff that Pavel has done, and he's written in Strong First manuals before, about the importance of relaxation, and he cited some sort of Soviet research that showed that the highest level, like Olympic level athletes, generally had the ability to relax faster than anybody else. So that seems like
yeah.
that pairs with what you're saying, is like to the tune of like 800% faster, if I'm
Oh
not
wow.
if I'm not mistaken. Now, again, I don't have the research off the top of my head. This is just something I'm recalling from having read some time back. But that does make sense. It's like if you were going to be a high level uh, physical specimen, you're going to need to be able to do these foundational steps. Your floor is going to have to be a lot higher,
Yeah.
and that seems like a perfect example, is that ability to relax as well as to amp up as fast as you need to. Like
Yeah.
if you can amp up fast rather than having to ramp up slowly, you're probably going to have greater overall physical output.
Right.
Very interesting. Well,
Yeah.
I want to turn this back to the strength side of things too, because I think this is a good segue to talk about this as a physical therapist. Well, we'll put it this way, like I have worked with a number of physical therapists. I would say only a select few have been like really exceptional, and others have been like kind of mediocre. And the ones that I thought were the best were the ones who were best at diagnosing exactly what it was that I was lacking and that I needed to fix. And so
Yeah.
because physical therapy is inherently about at least this is my perception of it, doing the things that maybe you didn't do before that opened you up to an injury or a tweak or, whatever the case may be. Um, Learning how to correctly apply those things is what's going to make your patient more successful in getting back on the right track. And I'm curious what characteristics you see as being, um, let's say, what characteristics you see as the best physical therapists have, because to me it seems like the ones who are most familiar with strength training tend to be the ones who, meaning like just standard, fitness type strength training, seem to be the ones who are better physical therapists. Has this been your experience, or is this just an n equals one observation on my part?
That's going to be true, and that has more to do with you know, like experience, I guess. So in PT school, what you learn is you learn all these assessment items.
Mm.
And it's all like range of motion, strength. When you saw a PT, what did you go? What did you go for?
Oh gosh, what haven't I gone for?
Yeah.
I remember, okay, probably I think the first time I saw a PT, it was an issue with my shoulder because I had frayed my labrum maybe a year or two prior, on deadlifts of all things, at least as
Yeah.
far as I could ascertain. It's hard to say 100% for sure. And I was preparing for my back then it was called RKC and now it's Strong First. I was going to prepare for my certification, and I just knew that if I woke up the way I had been waking up for over a year with my shoulder bothering me, it's probably going to hurt a lot worse with all the training I was about to do. So I decided
Yeah.
to go see a PT, um, and it was very helpful in particularly understanding the importance of balance in throughout the body and in the
Yeah.
shoulder girdle in particular. But we'll start with that one. We'll say, actual tissue damage in
Yeah.
particular.
Okay. From a tissue damage perspective, like every PT should be able to like figure that out.
Hmm.
Like, because that's kind of like fundamentals of school. That's what you're doing, all your special tests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The thing that'll separate where PTs start to get separated is kind of like, let's see, like their experience with the activity that you're doing.
Hmm.
So like if you came to see me in the clinic and it's like I have more assessment items than other PTs purely because of that. So if you came in to see me and you're like, hey, my shoulder hurts, it's like, all right, well, what hurts? You could start telling me like all the kettlebell movements that bother you,
Hmm.
right? And just by you telling me that, it's like, oh, like it's like high volume snatches starts to bother my shoulder.
Hmm.
Um, my get up on that side is substantially weaker. Probably one of the best mobility tests out there would be like a bent press.
Hmm.
Like what's that feel like? Most of your like rotator cuff repair, labor repair stuff, like they can't even get into that position.
Hmm.
Just because the stiffness in the shoulder. And it's like,
Hmm.
hey, guess what? This is probably a good movement for you because like you don't even have that. I guess it's kind of like shoulder extension, but really it's kind of abduction. It depends on when you kind of look at it.
Yeah.
Uh, but because of that, and me knowing the movements that you can't do, and then knowing what it takes to train for a snatch test,
Hmm.
like that's what would make me different than someone that has not done that.
Yeah.
So in reality, like I'm not a body part expert, I'm an activity expert.
Hmm.
So like your buddy that you're talking about is a power lifter. Like if I'm not a power lifter, but he is. So like whenever someone comes in, like he could start asking like, "Oh, what's your training look like? Oh, you're using this. Oh, you're doing that." I was like, "It's terrible training. No wonder why everything hurts." Or like, what are the other things that you're doing? Like he'd be able to diagnose that simply because of like the experience. So he either needs to like have probably a high level understanding of the activity or have worked with lots of people that do it. Ideally,
Hmm.
it's both. But there's enough people out there that not don't necessarily that have just spent a lot of time treating that population.
Hmm.
I think those are rare, versus like the people that have actually done that.
Hmm.
So if you can find an activity expert, then I think you're always gonna like have an advantage. And that's what seems to separate it. Because a lot of times, like PTs are normal people, so they fall for the same traps that normal people fall for.
Sure.
Like like I've with CrossFit, for example, like there are a lot of like when you go to a CrossFit gym, I've been going to one recently, and I look at a workout, and I'm like, man, this workout's dumb. I don't want to do it at all. It's like it's going to it's gonna ruin today.
Yeah.
Like, or this workout's gonna ruin tomorrow. That might be a Dan John thing where it's like, don't let today ruin tomorrow.
Right.
But that's a lot of it's all like scale and stuff like that. You'll see a lot of PTs that will be in CrossFit gyms and like, oh yeah, let's do this workout. Let's do this workout. It's like, well, what's this workout do? It's like, what's the purpose of it?
Yeah.
They fall into the same things, or they go to like fitness classes where they do a lot of like squat jumps, or they go to Orange Theory, which is fine exercise, but it's not a training program.
Right.
So they don't really know, like, um, how like someone can be an expert in something and then they'll tell you about something that's not part of their expertise, and you're like, man, you are dumb when it comes to
Oh,
that.
yes.
And then it almost makes you lose faith in like their expertise in whatever they're an expert in,
Yeah.
right? So it's kind of the same thing if you're trying to help me get back to running, and then you tell me about like you go do this thing because it's a good workout. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm already I no longer I can no longer believe anything you say.
Yeah, you're already skeptical at a minimum. You're like, okay, if somebody's using this terminology, they've clearly divorced this idea of movement quality, and long-term gains from exercise, where there really shouldn't be this split. It should be something
Yeah.
that is along the continuum. That's certainly been my experience.
Yeah. So that's the activity thing. Like,
Hmm.
here's an example. Like, I have a one of my old bosses, PT in Major League Baseball. So like he actually had people that would be on a rehab assignment, and they would come back to Texas to work with him
Hmm.
for specific things because he knew, um, you know, hey, you got this injury, you've had this surgery, this is how you rehab it. We need to start throwing here. You need to be throwing at this point here. Like, he had this process for getting them back, you
Hmm.
know. And then he taught a lot of courses on the shoulder, knew a lot about shoulder surgery, et cetera, et cetera. At one point, someone recommended like a CrossFit guy to him, and like he's got this expertise in the shoulder, but it's related to baseball. So you
Mm.
get someone that's like a CrossFitter, it's like overhead lifting, et cetera, et cetera. Like, his expertise is not like he is now a novice.
Yeah.
He's no longer an expert. Like, he can be an expert for like 6 weeks when you're like trying to get this guy out of the acute phase, and maybe you got to do whatever, whatever. But once he's back to like doing his sport, like his expertise is gone.
Hmm.
Um, you know, is is that person good enough to recognize? Is the clinician good enough to recognize that, hey, this is no longer my expertise? You need to go see somebody else.
Yeah.
80% of the time, they are not.
Hmm.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, you kind of want to. It's like, oh, I want to follow this guy. I want to learn this thing.
Hmm.
Um, so depending on where you meet that, if in 5 years he could have more expertise in this activity if he like committed to it. But why would
Right.
he do that? He's already doing his thing as a baseball guy.
Yeah, no, it's a very good observation because, first of all, Dan Kennedy, very famous marketer, has pointed out the absurdity of uh, how people view experts in one thing. Like he said, for instance, that now he's obviously, I would say, probably the world's leading expert in marketing, maybe the best who's ever done it. But he would have people who would ask him like relationship advice, meaning like his clients and stuff like that. And he's
Yeah,
been divorced twice. He's like, I'm the last person you should be asking
yeah,
about something so completely unrelated and something I've clearly, fumbled in a number of times. But yeah, I think it also doesn't help that sometimes these experts have acolytes who then kind of imagine, okay, well, this person's this smart at one thing, so they must be smart at everything. And so it's probably easier then for people who have that level of respect from those who pay them a good amount of money, putting aside their ego and saying, well, you know what, this is like my lane that I know the best, but you should go see whoever now that you're at this phase. I think that's very hard for people to do, especially when they're getting all this praise and what have you from the people who work with them. And I don't think it's like kind of like you're describing, it's probably not the sort of a thing where it's malicious, like I just want to make more money from this person, but more like, I went to PT school. I went to school for however many years, people pay me X amount of money. So of course I can figure this problem out. It's probably very hard for people to do that.
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
least I would imagine.
Yeah. I've done it before. I've tried to like, oh, let me figure this problem out. And, you know, at times to the detriment of the patient.
Yeah.
Um, so and sometimes sometimes people have, that's a easy, the baseball thing is an easy one because it's like, oh, you need to go see a baseball person,
Yeah.
but then like for normal people, it's like, oh well, there's no one that can figure this out, so we might as well spend the time to do it.
Right.
um so
Now, here's another question again on this line of strength training in particular. This is something I'm especially uh, fascinated by. Um, there's some degree of carryover, I would say, between the training side of things and then the rehab side of things. And, for instance, one of the things I see, there's some popular PTs that I follow online, and I noticed kind of like a pattern in their training where it's like so and so came in with shoulder pain. And, when he or she tried to do a military press, there's always this pain in their shoulder. And so I tested, for instance, their external rotation, and they were fine on one side, not so fine on the side that hurt them. So I had them do XYZ. I'm sure you've seen a million of these.
yeah.
And, for me, one of the things I always include in my own training, I don't call it prehab per se. It's like I think it's good for balancing out the muscles because I just know that I have similar issues. So I'll throw in shoulder external rotations with a dumbbell. I'll do like lateral raises and dumbbell flies and things like that. And even though it's not the main part of my training, uh, seems like it's kept me on the straight and narrow. So the question then is for physical therapy, like what are some of the things that set apart physical therapy, or the exercises done in physical therapy from those that might be done in regular training? Like there seems like there's some sort of a blend between the two of them, but there's also an approach that PTs take. For instance, a lot more isometrics training or static type of training that gets used almost immediately, but then eventually gives way to something else. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Whenever your shoulder was messed up, how long did it take to get back to where you feel like you're like, okay, now I can do what I want to do, or do you not feel that yet?
Well, for me personally, my shoulders have felt fine. I mean, I've had a couple of issues over the years that were, I mean, it was easy to tell it was just overuse, and it was just going to take time to get over. So
Yeah.
I would include some other things, but for me, actually, more than anything, it would be like in the upper back. Like I'll have either one or the other rhomboid will like lock up or be like threatening to lock up, and
Yeah.
I can just feel it. So that for me is a much more common thing. But yeah, in terms of the shoulders themselves, they've mostly behaved themselves for quite a while, actually.
What are you doing when you feel like your rhomboid is going to lock up?
A lot of it is, for instance, if I'm spending a little bit too much time in front of the computer or seated, like in this sort of fetal position,
Okay.
that certainly doesn't help. The other thing I've noticed actually is um, overhead pressing work specifically with a paucity of training of the surrounding muscles seems to exacerbate it. Like if I were to just do, let's say, military presses or just a bunch of Turkish get-ups or something like that, and then I don't do anything for, the rear delts or lateral or the medial delts or shoulder external rotation or anything else for the upper back, it just seems like it has a tendency to get, one rhomboid or the other angry.
Okay. Yeah, that's a. I don't know if anyone's ever going to know the answer to that, but
Yeah.
when at least my approach to rehab, and I'll change it at times, but um, probably the best example of this would be the foot and the ankle. So, whenever I was studying for like my orthopedic specialty exam, um, as I was reading the book about the foot, they were talking about the way the foot stabilizes itself. And then stability of the foot is based off of three things. One is the shape of the foot, like the bones lock and unlock when you pronate and supinate.
Hmm.
Number two was the ligaments. And number three, I think, was like the musculature of the feet. But then they went on to say, like, if you think of the cross-sectional area of the muscles of the foot, they're not strong enough to withstand the forces of anything, like
Hmm.
walking, running, jumping. Like your body's going through like 3 to 4 times ground reaction forces when you walk, but the muscles of the foot are super tiny. So
Hmm.
what that means is the as far as like absorbing ground reaction forces, it has more to do with the leg, the calf, the knee, the hip, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever I look at rehab exercises, I look at what is it I'm trying to do? What muscle am I thinking I'm working? Can that muscle even tolerate the forces of what I'm asking it to do?
Hmm.
If in my head, if I answer that as a no, I really don't worry about the that muscle at all.
Hmm.
It's kind of why I don't really care much about glute med. Whenever you talk about like landing mechanics, because like
Hmm.
when you're landing, the glute med is the size of a deck of cards. So if I need stability in the leg, I don't think it's going to come from that muscle. I'm not saying it's not important, but like in PT school, it's like, oh, your knees caving in, glute med. I was like, is that going to stop me? Like that little bitty muscle.
Hmm.
So it's just like a logic thing. So the idea of strengthening the cuff or strengthening the glute med or strengthening the foot intrinsics, in my opinion, the idea doesn't scale.
Hmm.
Like as I increase intensity of whatever I'm doing, I'm not sure that matters.
Hmm.
Um, you can, if you've done everything else and that's the only thing left, then sure. So like when you think of the shoulder, when you think of get ups and stuff like that, it's like get ups or running or anything. It's like the doing get ups should make the shoulder stronger.
Hmm.
As long as you can create tension in all the right places.
Right.
Holding my arm statically, I should have pec tension, I should have lat tension, I should have stuff around the shoulder blade. And then as I go through space and my arm is changing positions, there's it should be it should be doing its job.
Hmm.
So if you're posterior delt, yeah, I think posterior delt's important, just because it's probably underdeveloped, just the nature of things we do.
Hmm.
Um, the cuff exercise you're doing, maybe it's if it's progressive overload, then yes, you would be getting stronger just based off of like this the scientific principle of it.
Hmm.
But it's probably more of a like pain relieving quality of those exercises that are helping you out, which is fine. Like if it feels fine doing it, taking care of the tissues, like keeping the tissue quality fine, then continue to do those things.
Hmm.
But just the nature of the movement you're doing, like uh big muscles move big weight. So if I'm holding something over, if I'm holding a 32 kilo bell overhead,
Hmm.
like my cuff's not doing anything. I mean, it's doing something, but I'd have to, if I have the pec dysfunction, lat dysfunction, shoulder range of motion dysfunction, those are going to affect the cuff more than the weight itself.
Hmm.
Think of it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And my approach, for instance, with training like my innie and outie muscles, as we might call them, has been more to do with that. It's like I always keep the goal. So it's
Yeah.
like, lifting this or doing that exercise and so on and so forth is always the goal. And then secondarily, it's like I would throw in a set of, this, that, or the other thing. And, I tend to look at it, and I'll be curious to hear what your thoughts are because I tend to look at it as like, your joint has a bunch of stuff pulling at it because it's got tendons connected to muscles, which are what are going to help it to move through free space. And so the sense that I've gotten is that um, if you look at those things as being like, guy wires on a tower, and there's just one that you've trained to pull more in one direction rather than the other, so the problem or the dysfunction might come from just that lack of balance. I mean, is there any truth to that, or is that kind of an oversimplification, or just requires a very specific context?
I think it's both. It is an oversimplification, but it helps. Um, so when you think of like I went to a school that cares about stuff like that, and then lots of other programs will bash them on social media. But
That's just a way of life, you know.
it's a
It's
way of
like,
life, yeah, which is
yeah, you
fine.
express
Yeah,
an
really,
opinion, and then
it's kind of
people
like
have
how
said,
I, yeah, it's that method is how I enter the system. I guess if
yeah.
you think of it that way, it's like if you're standing in front of me and I'm looking at things, I would say, you know, the average person looks like this, you look like that.
Hmm.
So by saying by way of that, I think if you are going to make a movement, this is I'm trying to predict what's going to happen, and then I
Hmm.
would test it, and then I would confirm or deny if my hypothesis is correct.
Hmm.
So start thinking of like what you're talking about, the stiffness thing. Um, the oversimplification in that is like the guide wire thing. The
Hmm.
shoulder itself is a capsule, so the all the ligaments and tendons of the cuff are all continuous with that capsule.
Hmm.
Uh, I think just the way that we treat our shoulders, we kind of beat them up.
Hmm.
So all the trauma that happens to that capsule, kind of stiffens up, and then it'll pull you one way more than the other, and then
Right.
you'll kind of like kind of muscle length impairments. That's the like I went to Wash U, so they're the ones that kind of talk about all that stuff. So
Hmm.
partial docs, whatever. Um, so if you think of if my shoulder is rolled, if I my normal resting posture is my shoulder is rolled forward, that means that I'm going to have like more stiffness on the front of my shoulder, and I'm
Hmm.
going to be looser in the back of my shoulder. Right. So from a stability standpoint, you want that balance that you're talking about. So
Hmm.
the only way to get that would be to do more things. Posterior delt would kind of you put some stiffness back in the posterior delt,
Hmm.
and then you would have to work on putting the humeral head where we think it's supposed to be, and then make the muscles contribute equally to whatever task you're doing.
Right.
Like I have a shoulder injury, so if I do get ups, like the heavier I get on my left, like if I do like sets of 2 or 3 as I get heavier, my trap will be tight, but it's not bad. But if
Hmm.
I do like lots of sets, then like my trap is tighter and it doesn't feel good.
Hmm.
So like, I work on fixing the mobility of things, but the pain doesn't bother me.
Hmm.
I just I wouldn't even call it pain. It's just like some stiffness there because I know the what's wrong with my shoulder. I'm missing some motion, so I'm going to compensate.
Right.
So I can still do the work. I just have to manage the volume of it, and I
Yeah.
still do like the accessory stuff. At the hopes that it fixes it. Will it? I don't know. I'm not convinced that I'm going to fix the stiffness
Yeah.
because it's better, but it's still there, and it's just from like more like traumatic stuff, like
Y-
falling on the shoulder and things.
Yeah, it seems like some of the trauma. I've been fortunate in that I've had very few really traumatic issues, but I know some people who have, and it's like, like people I've trained, they'll ask, "Hey, what about this?" Because I can see there's a difference with, in how I do. I had a guy I saw a couple weeks ago. He said, his snatch on one side was easier, and the other side it was a little offset, and it was due to some physical issue that he'd had. And I said, the technique looks fine. It's obviously different from one side to the other, but I can't really tell you that you'll ever be able to make them equal because I don't really know. It's out of my level of expertise. But as long as it's not causing you any pain
Yeah,
and it's not
exactly.
causing you dysfunction, I say just keep doing it.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, and we all have normal asymmetries. It's just like if one side looks different than the other, that's fine.
yeah.
Um, as long as you don't, you may have to, you maybe can only do 3 sets on one side and maybe only 2 sets on the other. You're still doing the work. So
Yeah, agreed. Um, Well, here's something that I'm very curious about in particular because I know that a lot of I see this in a lot of PT stuff in general, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, but is the role of isometric training in not just rehab. I mean, we'll start with rehab or physical therapy, but then its connection to strength training because this is something that I think again, it kind of fell out of favor. It used to be that isometrics were all the rage in
Yeah.
the strength world, and people realized like, well, I can't really measure it, so I feel like I don't know if I'm making progress. So, mentally they just check out from it. But it still plays a huge role in physical therapy. And in terms of building strength or restoring strength, what is the role of isometrics or static training in getting people stronger and strengthening those relationships between muscles where maybe there's a disparity in strength?
No. Well, there's a short-term benefit of it, which is just kind of like pain relief.
Hmm.
Depending on you, ideally you're trying to, if for pain relief, you're trying to go for the tendon.
Yeah.
So you can do your isometric holds at different intensities, different times for the pain relieving benefit of it. Um, trying to the thought is the tendon is reactive, so you're
Hmm.
trying to just still load it. I think there's like studies out there where it's like bed rest for 2 weeks is basically you might as well die just because like the way that the tendon just kind of goes to like this like soup. So pain relieving standpoint, you're trying to load the tendon as much as you can without uh, irritating it too much.
Hmm.
Then from a strength standpoint, where you're trying to treat the like degenerative portion of the tendon,
Mm.
that's where you got like your longer holds and your higher intensities of like that 7 to 8 out of 10 pain.
Hmm.
And then it's just a way to like as soon as you're able to tolerate like full range of motion, like you should or isotonic, it doesn't have to necessarily be full range of motion, but
Hmm.
as soon as you're able to like tolerate the actual movements, then you should do those. And then maybe if you think you've got like tendon issues or you want to like kind of keep your tendons kind of healthy, then like the isometric program is something that you could do once or twice a week as like a finisher or something like that, as
Hmm.
long as the effort is high, because it's like a low cost from a recovery standpoint.
Hmm.
But like if someone comes in and their knees like super irritated, I'll start with isometrics, and then as soon as they're like, "Hey, it feels better," then we start moving. Um, so it's just kind of depends on the activity matters too. Um, if you're doing a lot of jumping and stuff like that, your tendon has to work a lot, so you have to
Right.
make sure that your training helps you meet the demands of whatever your activity is.
Yeah, there's still that said principle, the
Yeah,
specific adaptations to impose demand. So it's like,
yeah.
well, I'm not defining that for you, by the way, just for the listener, because, I figured
Well,
you,
and write that down. I've never heard
yeah,
that.
exactly, exactly. For once, I've taught a PT something.
A
Um, yeah, I think that,
lot of them probably don't know that. So
oh,
I
okay,
really
good. All right. Maybe, ironically, that actually might be useful for any
yeah,
PTs listening. But yeah, I think the interesting thing is I like to look at training in terms of like, okay, well, obviously you want to do the thing that you want to get good at, but if there are other things that you probably should have gotten good at before and you haven't done them, you should do that. And I think one of the gaps that a lot of people have is in like just isometric strength in
yeah,
general. And I'm really very curious or interested in the idea of strengthening the soft tissues because we think mostly in the fitness world about, making your muscles bigger, making them stronger. But because the tendon is supposed to be, if I understand correctly, 2 to 3 times stronger than the muscle that it's attached to, you get to a point where the muscle might just outpace the strength of the tendon. So at best, you just hit a plateau and you're just frustrated. But at
yeah.
worst, you might end up with some pain. And so I see isometrics as a one potential way to kind of help bridge that gap. But it takes longer for tendons to adapt than muscles. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. Tendons, yeah, because the blood supply isn't as much, so like recovery is less.
Yeah. No,
If you really
the
think about it, like there's actually isometrics. You do a lot of isometrics. People don't think about it. Like front squatting is isometrics, deadlifting is isometrics.
mhm.
Like you're moving your hips, but you're locked in with your shoulders and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, snatching is isometrics because of just the grip.
Yeah.
So in a way, you kind of get it in there. Um, it's just if your program is complete. Most of my patients, when they come in, I'll ask them, it's like, all right, well, what's your program look like? And then they'll kind of tell me all these things, and it's like, oh, okay, well, you just need to start. If it's like a pain problem, it's like, all right, let's do some pain relief things,
Hmm.
and then let's put you on a program that's a little more complete,
Hmm.
that has you doing all these things, uh, versus just like Orange Theory. Let me get my heart rate up as high as I can.
Right. Right.
Orange Theory probably actually is the most scientific of all of them. They actually try to like make your heart rate go up and go down. It's just every day.
Yeah.
I have to wear my
Not a lot
monitor.
of
Yeah.
variety, we might say.
Oh, let's say that again.
Not a lot of variety in a certain sense.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're trying to raise the ceiling and not the floor.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. I mean, we could probably talk endlessly about, fitness and the physical therapy side of things,
Yeah.
but for the people who want to follow you and want to get more information from somebody who actually lives it and and lifts weights and helps other people to get back on track, where would be a good place for people to follow you, maybe to gain some insights into your approach and things of that nature?
Twitter is where we are mostly. So that's just at Bowtied_Bengal. Um, and then most of our content is there. We have the website, I'm Hurt Now What. That's where the website's more of like, we started as kind of like, hey, let's get on the first page of Google. And then now it's more of like an infrastructure piece more so than
Mhm.
anything else. We still update it. There's still some stuff on there. And then you can sign up to our newsletter either via Twitter or the website. And we have a bunch of like free programs that we give out on just kind of like knee pain, back pain, shoulder, just like general mobility stuff.
Mhm.
Um, Quote unquote mobility, just kind of like the range of motion stuff, like we talked about in our email, where it's not like true mobility, but it's the commercial mobility,
Right.
where it's just like, hey, let's just get started on moving through full ranges of motion. But Twitter and the blog, and then getting in our newsletter is the easiest way to get all the information from us. And then
Yeah,
we
and
also,
I was just gonna say I really enjoy the emails that you send out because they're very informative. They're like very engaging, and of course, the Twitter is awesome too because there's tons and tons of content there. So, the for people who are on Twitter, it is at bowtied_Bengal, and I'll put that in the show notes. And then for the website, it's just imhurtnowwhat.com, correct?
yeah.
Awesome. Any final thoughts, final notes for the gentle listeners before we send them back off into the weird and wild interwebs?
No, I don't think so. I think the main points for me is just like, uh, I tell people all the time whenever it's like, uh, extreme example, Marines gearing up for either their PFT, which is a 3 mile run, or their CFT, which is like an 880-meter run in like boots.
Hmm.
It's like, well, what's your training look like? And they're like, oh, well, usually about 6 weeks before I just start cramming and running. It's like, okay, well, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
um, and then it's more of like the program you're doing. It's like the best people in the world don't do this. Why do you think it's going to work for you? Um, but then it's incumbent on me to know what the best people are doing. So that's kind of how I structure my own education. So
Makes good sense. Yeah, well, I think that mentality of like, I'm just going to cram as though it were like a test where you could just use your short-term memory to,
yeah,
ace it and then forget it all later. Doesn't really work with the body. Your body's going to remember all the abuse you heap upon it. So take it
yeah,
upon yourself to get educated with your training. And if you have gotten hurt, check out Bowtied Bengal at Bowtied_Bengal on Twitter, as well as I'mHurtNowWhat.com. A lot of phenomenal information from a PT who actually knows a thing or two about how to get people unscrewed up. So thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
yeah. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And folks, as always, have fun and happy training.